Today we want to talk about evolution of the payment system. We talked last time a little bit about that. We talked about in the earliest days there was a barter economy, goods and services trading for other goods and services. And there was no common thing serving as money as the medium of exchange. After that, commodity money came along. A few commodities were used as money. And by money, what we mean is, again, society had settled on a relatively small number of items that were used to pay for other items. And the earliest of the commodities that were used as money, we mentioned barley, wool, and silver. And over time, different places, some places didn't really have the silver, and so and some places didn't have the barley, and some places didn't have the wool. So at other places, it would be things like copper ingots. I mentioned to you sometimes porpoise teeth, sometimes tobacco leaves, sometimes stones. There's a Pacific island of Yap, and like if we've got a picture of the United States, and over here is like China, Japan, I'll put a J there, then and then Hawaii is out here someplace. Someplace down in this general area would be an island Yap. And the people, and there's a chain of islands. They are all scattered out, and each one is a small island, but they're scattered out over a large area, almost as large as the United States. And so, anyway, there's an island there in this Micronesian region or chain of islands, and called Yap, and they used limestone rocks as money. You can sort of imagine. Yes, I know, my art is not so hot. Anyway, they use limestone rocks as their money. This is a volcanic island. These islands out in the middle of the ocean are volcanic islands. And so they didn't have any limestone rock there. The limestone rock was brought to Yap and was formed in the shape of kind of like a disc. And they cut a hole in the middle of it, chisel a hole in the middle of it. And the reason for that was so they could put a stick through there, and then there'd be some guys get on the front and some guys get on the back and pick it up and carry it someplace. And that was their money. And rocks do not have to be very big until it's more than you can carry, right? I mean, it's like a rock that size is probably more than most people can pick up. So anyway, people in that situation had rocks as money. And what would happen is that this rock might be put over here, at the side of a house or a building or the side of the road, and it would just stay there. And so let's say that I own this stone. I might come to you and say, hey, would you sell me 10 goats and a pig? And you say, yes. And I say, I'll pay you this money here for it. And you say, okay. And so I take the goats and the pig and I go home, and now that money is yours, but you just leave it there. Right? You don't have to carry that money away for it to be yours. And the population was relatively small, and people recognize these rocks. And so basically you could just leave it there. You don't carry the money in your checking account. You put it in the bank, and then as far as you know, it just sits in one spot. You don't know what happens to that. And so this is a very similar idea with this limestone rocks as money. Now, what you might think is that the bigger the stone, the more valuable the money. But that's not the way it worked. The value of these stones, these limestone rocks as money, was based on the cost of getting the stone to the island. And so in the earliest days, they were bringing these rocks to the island in canoes, outriggers, things like that. And it was very difficult to bring a heavy stone to the island. Not only difficult where, boy, that's a lot of weight to put on this small boat, but also those small boats would turn over and people would drown and things like that out in the middle of the ocean. Later on, as shipping technology improved, it was possible to bring bigger and bigger stones to the island, but the value of those stones as money went down. And I guess what I'm saying is, don't just leap to the conclusion that a bigger stone means more valuable money. A dime is a lot more valuable than a penny, 10 times as valuable, but smaller, right? And certainly a quarter is not 25 times as big as a penny. And so it doesn't always just comes down to the size of the unit. A $1 bill is the same size as a $100 bill. And so what I'm telling you is it's the same idea there. Okay? There's a story, don't know if it was true, don't know how well documented this is, but some people were bringing a stone in, like there's some other island over there and they've got this limestone money, and so somebody needed to make a payment to somebody on Yap. And so here comes the boat across the water and they're paddling along and so forth. and the waves get higher and higher and higher, and then the boat capsizes and goes to the bottom of the ocean. The guys swim ashore and say, oh, that was terrible, you know, and where's that stone? It's at the bottom of the ocean. Everybody said, that's okay. And so then the guy that owned that stone, the one it was going to be delivered to, he just said, I keep it down there at the bottom of the ocean. And then he could go around and buy some goats and pigs and whatever it was he's buying, and then whoever he was buying it from, he just said, you know, the money's down there. And they go, okay. So they didn't actually ever see that stone again. But ownership of it passed. But you don't see the money in my bank account. If I write you a check, you don't see that money. Right? So this is not as strange as you might think it is. So anyway, but what I'm saying to you is this would be an example as a commodity money. Okay? It's a thing that serves as money. And as time goes by, we got to more refined forms of money. And by the way, there is a long, long list of commodity monies. And so anybody who says, I can write down that list, you can write down a list, but it just keeps going because throughout the ages, there have just been different things used as money. Money is so convenient that people somehow or another, without having a money and banking book, without having an economist tell them to do it, people just off in isolation will come up with the idea of money. Yes, sir?
Did they use anything to mark them for the value, or they just knew? Or?
Well, they didn't have, you know, it didn't say something like this, $8 on the stone. No, there was no marking of the value, but there's a relatively small population, a relatively small number of these stones, and so it's something that people would know. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh, there's Steve, you know, or whatever, the stone, the boulder, and I mean, they didn't call it Steve, I'm sure. But anyway, the point is they would recognize those. You know what I'm saying? And I've seen pictures of these before where there's just like some public building, like a pavilion or something like this, where there's a roof and some poles holding it up, no walls, because this is very, you know, it's tropical. And so anyway, but there'd be a place where people would meet, and there's just be like under a roof. And so anyway, next to this public meeting place, this pavilion, there'd just be a bunch of these stones just kind of leaned up along the wall over there. There's a short wall of foundation there, and they'd just be leaned up there. And also along the side of the road, just some public path where people pass. And you couldn't get that out of there. I mean, like if you say, I'm going to get rich and go out in the middle of the night, you couldn't pick it up. You had to get like a crew of people to do that. Well, yeah, but it doesn't take very big and you can't pick it up. You know what I mean? Is if somebody said, hey, you can be rich, just pick up this 500-pound boulder, you go, I guess I'm going to have to give up my opportunity there, you know, without getting a crew of people. And then all of a sudden, you know, people walking along and other people going, where are you going? With that pole, because you got to get a pole through there and pick it up, and then how do you spend it? You know, you show up a year later and go, oh, look what I got. People say, oh, you're the one that stole that. So it's just laid over there to the side, kind of like a deposit, only just deposit it in, you know, a ditch or deposit up next to a building. Okay. Anyway, but the weight of it made it very difficult to make payments over a distance. It would be great if you had a small town or something like that, a village, and everybody recognized this. But let's say you needed to pay somebody 20 miles away, 50 miles away, and you got to get that there. Which kind of reminds me of a little bit of a story. This is an area that we used to do business with, the United States, more than we do right now. But we used to have some islands down there that were uninhabited, and this would be 40 years ago, 50 years ago, would go there and set off atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, to test them, see how they work. And then, you know, there'd be an island over there, and we'd use that, and then we'd set up an observation post several miles away and observe that. And so anyway, we had to pay money to this island chain in order to use their territory for that purpose. And over time, then, there would be laws passed, you know, sort of welfare programs and things like that, and we would basically send a lot of, you know, at one point, send things like canned fruits and vegetables and things like this to the island, and they would arrive and then just sit down on the dock and finally deteriorate in the sea, you know, the breeze and so forth, and the salt and so forth, and make those cans, and then they just make them rust, and then they just push them into the ocean and get rid of them. They didn't really want those, but, you know, we were doing all these things for these people. And so anyway, how long ago? 15 years ago maybe, there was a story about some kind of a diplomat flying into the United States, into Washington, D.C. to see somebody, to do something. I don't even know what the event was. But they had heard about the United States having this big national debt. And they said, we're going to help you pay that off. And they brought a bunch of these stones, you know, and then, but I think that was more ceremonial than anything. They knew what dollars were and things by then.
Did we pay them in stones like that?
No, we did not pay them in stones. Funny. Funny, oh yeah, we should have given them limestones. You know, Springfield is basically on a limestone shelf here. And so we'd be rich if we lived over in Yap. Anyway, there are a lot of people who are rich there though because we pay so much money for the use of some of these islands and so forth. There are stories about, I mean, small islands, there are stories about people getting these payments from the United States government and they would buy a car with these payments because they got nothing else to buy, you know? So they would buy a car, but there's not a lot of roads. And so then they would get the car and then basically just sit it in one spot and never drive it and go out and get in it and turn the radio on and sit around, you know, and listen to the radio play and stuff like that. Neat idea, huh? There's an island over someplace south of China. China, let's say, ends right there. And New Guinea, here's Australia. New Guinea is between China and the Philippines and so forth and Australia. And so the people living in New Guinea here in the interior were the last people on Earth to come into contact with the rest of us. Right? Everybody knew about everybody else except the people in New Guinea did not know about us in interior New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. They didn't know about us and we didn't know about them until the late 20s, early 30s. And I'm going to put 1930 with a little question mark, but sometime around this time. Okay? And so, anyway, what would happen is, and the reason they didn't know about us and we didn't know about them is, over a large part of this island of New Guinea, there were mountains. And I don't mean to say like high hills. I mean very jagged, sharp mountains, and the mountain range would go for miles and miles and miles. And so it was hard to cross those mountains. And then within that area that was surrounded by all these mountains, there were different tribes that controlled each bit of turf, each bit of property. And so if you even said, oh, I want to go see the ocean, you've got to cross the territory of other tribes that maybe you'd be at war with or so forth, and they would take you captive or kill you or something of that nature. And so what people did is just stay at home. Okay? And so anyway, these people were living there in interior New Guinea, and they would just be walking around, and Papua New Guinea is what it's called, and they would be walking around, and they would look up, and there would be an airplane flying over. And then they would talk about it, like, what is that? And, you know, and it'd be sort of like if we saw a dinosaur or something like that flying over, one of these pterodactyls, is that what they are? Flying over, we would go, wow, that is really a big dinosaur. And so they were kind of like, what the heck is that? What do you think that is? And, you know, they'd make up their own little stories and things like that. And so, anyway, what happened was, and I think they were seeing Japanese airplanes flying over. And so anyway, at a certain point, there were these guys in Australia, and they were gold miners. And one of them got the idea that, I bet there's gold over there. And they just thought, it's just this empty territory, let's go see. And they got an airplane, and they flew over there, and they landed that airplane in interior New Guinea, boom, landed. Now, something you need to know in this story, first of all, the people who were living there had black skin. And secondly, when they would die, they would take the dead body, the carcasses, and put them out and just kind of hang them on branches and vines and things like that. And they would just be out in the sun. They didn't have burial ceremonies and so forth. And they would just lay out in the sun, and then, you know, the birds would come along and peck them and stuff like that and eat the flesh and whatever. But then being out in the sun, this is very tropical, their skin would just start bleaching out and it would just get white, just white, white, white. And so, anyway, what happened was this airplane landed, and the people got off the airplane. They're from Australia. They had white skin. And then the natives, of course, they couldn't talk to each other the same language, but the natives looked at that and they said, hey, you see that? That came out of the sky. It landed. And here are these white beings, creatures, came out of that. These must be our ancestors, because, you know, here are all these dead bodies over here, and they're white, 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 and here are these people getting off this airplane, white, white, white. Those must be our ancestors. That must be Uncle Steve. I used Steve a minute ago. Uncle Bob. And that's what they're talking like, oh, these are our spirits. Ooh. So then these guys got off the airplane, and they say, you know, stuff like, hey, where can we get some gold? You got any gold? And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. So anyway, this goes on for a while. Come to find out, the people of interior New Guinea, there were a few rivers that would run, you know, from mountains down to the ocean and so forth, and a little bit of trade would occur. Somebody, just the coast of New Guinea, would come up the river and do a little bit of trading, and they would bring shells that they had found down by the ocean. And so the people in interior New Guinea, they had these shells through their trade, whatever it was they had to trade, and they got a few shells, and then the people at the, you know, the first ones that came into contact with the traders, they would trade with other tribes and so forth. And so over the centuries, shells had become used as a form of money in New Guinea. And so these guys landed their airplane, and they look around, and they finally were able to work out a little bit of rough communication. I think they got one of these traders that had had a little bit of contact with the outside world and with these people. And anyway, and they found out kind of how their economy worked, and they found out, oh, they're using shells. And so then they said things like, well, we need a place to stay, we need something to eat, we need this, we need that. And at first, the natives were just giving all this stuff away. Oh, stay in our tent, eat our food, whatever you want, we'll do it, because they thought, these are spirits, you know, these are our ancestors. This is Uncle Bob. But then after they found out these are just humans, and how'd they find that out? And the answer is because the natives came up and took something from the Australian explorers, and anyway, and then the Australians killed them, shot them with a gun. And then they said, no, Uncle Bob wouldn't have done that. And so then they found out those are people. And so then the people said, we need a place to stay, we need food, blah, blah, blah. And the natives said, no. And so the Australian guys, after they found out how everything worked, they got on their airplane and flew back to Australia and filled the airplane up with shells. And then they came back and they landed and they got off and they've got all these crates of shells, and then they just start, you know, basically paying rent and buying stuff and so forth, and they were living high. But these shells that were brought in from the ocean, and they could have gone down to the coast and found a few, but they wanted to bring in thousands and thousands and thousands. And guess what they had in New Guinea, Australia? Inflation. Right? Increasing the money supply, the shell supply, by vast amounts. There's all this spending, and then prices started going up. And something that had been 3 shells became 6, and then 12, and then 27, and 94, and 112. So anyway, commodity money. Okay? They had commodity money inflation in Europe in what? The 16th century. What happened was a bunch of Spanish explorers, really conquistadors is what they're called. Conquistadors, conquerors, left Spain, came to the New World, Mexico, Peru, and so forth, conquered that territory, got a bunch of gold and silver, took the gold and silver back to Spain. The Spanish said, oh, this is great, you know, king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, and their descendants. And they got all this gold and silver coming back from the New World, and then they started buying stuff. And that increased the money supply of Europe, and so prices started going up. Same idea. Okay? So anyway, we've talked about a couple of sort of strange cases, the shells in Papua New Guinea, and then the limestone rocks as money. These are kind of unusual cases, but there have been all kinds of things serve as money over the years. We talked about coins last time. Where? In Lydia. These discs were about the size of a dime, pretty thick. I've seen them actually, and there are a few scattered around the world in private collections. Where I have seen several of them is in London Museum. And you remember what they're made of? Electrum, this combination of gold and silver. Okay. After that, paper money. And I think that's where we got to last time, right? China, about 900 AD. plus or minus. Now, you cannot have paper money until you've invented paper. I mean, that is more or less a requirement. That's why they call it paper money, in fact. Okay, so the Chinese developed money, or a paper. They had ink. You've got to have some kind of a printing press process. If you had paper and just the pencil or pen in your hand, it'd be difficult to make money because each one would look different. And then if you took that and went out and tried to spend it, people go, that didn't look like the one I saw yesterday, and they wouldn't accept it. So we need some way, and they had a printing press, some way of printing identical pieces of this paper money time after time after time. So you need the paper, you need the ink, and you need the printing press, and there's one other thing you need, the idea. And they had all that stuff about 900 AD. And so what they did is they started printing currency. Now, the Emperor of China and so forth. Let me just ask you this question. Suppose you had, let's say, a printing press sitting up here. You owned it. And then you could turn the switch on and print a $20 bill. And out comes a $20 bill. And then you could push the button again and another $20 bill would come out. When would you turn that machine off? Never. Well, guess what? The people of China figured that out. Just keep doing this. This is good. It actually is, I mean, lightning fast. You just figure that out in no time at all. Make more and more and more. And so China's a big country, and it took time, but they just kept printing more and more and more of this. Not the common people, but the emperor. This printed more and more and more and was using that to go out and hire people and buy things and so forth. And they got to a point, sort of like with the shell money in New Guinea, they got to a point where there's this huge amount of paper money in circulation, and prices were just going up and up and up and up and up. And they said, they didn't really, they didn't have economists, so they just said, I don't know what it is about this demon paper money, but this is really messing up our economy. Let's stop this. And so they stopped printing paper currency. And then what happened is the Mongols came in. These are the people from Central Asia, and they came in and conquered China. Okay, the Mongols, Genghis Khan and his clan. Anyway, and by the way, they were fierce. They owned a big area. Maybe the largest empire anybody's ever had throughout history. Is this true? Yeah? Anyway, China is about the size of the United States, and so controlled all of China, but just go all the way really to Europe, Eastern Europe. And so, anyway, the Mongols came in and they said, and they learned a little bit about the culture, not too much, but about the culture of China. They mainly said, you can adopt our culture. And so anyway, the Mongols found out about this paper money and they said, that's a good idea. And they started printing paper currency again. This was after there had been a lapse. The Chinese found out that, this paper currency somehow or another leads to problems with our economy, a lot of complaining. And you know what the complaining would be. There would just be people out here who didn't have that paper currency and prices going up and up and up, and they just say, I can't afford to live. I'm very unhappy. Let's have a new ruler. And so anyway, the Chinese stopped doing this, but then the Mongols came in and they said, let's give it another try. And so then they did, and then guess what? It's just like that question I asked you before. If you had a machine and it would make money, how long would you keep that machine running? The answer is forever. And so then just more and more and more and more. And then they had a bad inflation problem in China again from this. Anyway, what happened, and it's over here kind of far, but what happened was there's this guy how does that work? No, it goes the other way, doesn't it? What, does Italy kind of have that? That looks like a boot, and that's what they call it. Anyway, here's Italy, and here was this guy from Venice named Marco Polo. And he and his family went on and they were from a merchant family, trading family. And what had happened over the years, this is a long, long distance. This is like, 4,000 or 5,000 miles from But anyway, what had happened over the years was there was trade that was taking place between China and Europe. And it wasn't just some trader say, oh, I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff here and bring it over here to Europe and sell it. It did not occur that way. What would happen is there would be a lot of short distance trade. Somebody would have something in China and send it 50 miles. Then that, whatever that thing is, might be there for a while and then be traded 200 miles away. And then somebody else traded. And then over a series of trades and possibly over the course of many years, finally these things would work their way to Europe. And it would be things like porcelain, China. We call it China, but porcelain. Things like silk. Okay, and so things were, and spices, we've heard about the spices and so forth. And those would come, some of them overland, and some of them would, at a certain point, get down to the ocean, and then they would bring those around and come up the Red Sea. Is it the Red Sea? And to was it the Red Sea? Anyway, up to Alexandria, Italy, and then across the Mediterranean, and then into Red Sea, and then into Europe. And so anyway, this was a very slow process. Alexandria is in Egypt. Who was it named after? Alexander the Great. And so this was a trading emporium. Not only did they do business with everybody in the Mediterranean, but also it was possible from China to come around and up the Red Sea and get pretty close to Alexandria and a little bit of overland trade up to the Nile and then Alexandria. And so anyway, this is, I think, the biggest trading center in the world at that time. And so anyway, Marco Polo and his family, they were doing all this business, and some of what they were trading was just sort of short-term trade, things that they had found in Italy and sell to somebody else in Italy or up into France and so forth. But some of these really rare exotic things were coming from Europe, and they said, gosh, it'd be great if we could get that stuff fast. What do we have to do? And the answer is, let's go there. And so Marco Polo's family, he was a boy when this all started off, but Marco Polo's dad and uncle and a group of them got together and they decided, we're going to go to China and start bringing this exotic stuff back from China. And so they took off and went, I've got kind of a bad map here. Let me get Australia out of there, that might help. So what they did is they went overland and then they got down by what we've called Sumer or Mesopotamia, and they started to get in a boat and take off across the Indian Ocean, go to China, and they didn't go very far, and they said, oh my God, we are going to drown. This boat's not enough, it's a big ocean. And so they went back and they started overland, and they just took this journey, and it just took forever, it seemed like, years, and they finally got to China. And they got there, and part of Marco Polo's family traded, got some things, and went home. And Marco Polo stayed. And he sort of fell in, became friends with the Mongol leaders of China. And, Genghis Khan had this, was it a grandson, a nephew? Kublai Khan. And so anyway, Marco Polo, by this time, he's kind of grown up, and he becomes friends with the Khan, the leader of China, the emperor, and stayed there for years. And so finally, he says, time for me to go home. And he headed home a little bit before, but around 1300 AD. And so Marco Polo heads home, he gets home, and brings some merchandise back, and he's had this great adventure and so forth. Now, the problem is this. There was no Italy. There was this Italian peninsula, but there was no country Italy. There were all these different city-states. There was Venice and Genoa and Florence and Rome and Pisa. And there were all these different city-states, and each one was like a country. And they were all kind of, not everyone, but most of them, kind of having these ongoing little battles with each other and fighting each other and trying to beat each other and so forth. And so Marco Polo comes home, and before very long, not very long at all, he gets caught up in one of these little wars, and he gets taken basically a prisoner. Now, in most wars, what they do is shoot you or whatever, and then that's just the end of you. But the Italians were doing this kind of stuff, and, this is an ongoing thing. And so what they would do is, if you were poor, maybe kill you, but if you're rich, what they do is take you a prisoner and lock you up and then sell you back to your family, ransom you. And so Marco Polo got taken prisoner, and they threw him in a jail, and he sat around for a while waiting to be ransomed back by his family. And so while he's sitting in jail, and it doesn't take very long to get tired of sitting in jail. And so people just sit around, they kind of tell each other stories and things like this, tall tales, amuse each other, amuse themselves. And so Marco Polo is sitting around this jail cell talking to other people, and he says, oh, let me tell you the story about the time I went to China. And they said, oh, that would be so funny. Why don't you tell us that story? And so he would tell these little adventures he had, different people he met, different kinds of animals and birds and so forth that he had encountered. But he'd tell these stories. And people always just took that to be a joke, like, this guy can make up a better story than anyone. And somebody was writing these stories down. And it wasn't taken all that seriously, but anyway, they wrote the story down. And then when Marco Polo gets out of jail, all these little notes of these stories he told, they took that and they published that as a book. And it turned out to be, it was a true story. The only thing is that book, people wanted to buy that book all over Europe. It was like China was this exotic place so far away. Again, about 1300 AD. And so when people read that book, they said, paper money. And it wasn't very long until they started printing paper money in Europe. And so what I told you last time is a little bit of a story about how coinage started off in this small area in Turkey and then got to Greece, and then this Greek that conquered this big territory, Alexander the Great, how coinage spread around the world because of Alexander the Great. Marco Polo is the guy who brought this idea of paper money back to Europe, and then the idea of spread, and so there's always been paper money since that time. The next step in our evolution of money is bank money, or bank currency. Okay, and the best example of this, and there are other examples, the Italians had their form of bank currency and so forth, but the best example of this, the most sort of pure, easy example, would be goldsmiths in England about what date do I have written down here? About 1633. I'll say plus or minus a little bit. This is AD. First of all, this word smith in England meant a craftsman. And so they had goldsmiths. Silversmiths would work on silver. Goldsmiths work on gold. Blacksmiths would work with iron. They had leathersmiths that would work with leather. Before we had a lot of things like rubber and plastics and whatever, they used leather for a lot of things, and so there'd be the leathersmith. There were different kinds of smiths. Okay? And so you've got a goldsmith that's doing things like making jewelry and false idols for people to worship. I don't know exactly what all they made with gold. But anyway, so you've got a goldsmith, and he's got a shop. I'll kind of make a little window here, and here's his front door. Anyway, and so the goldsmith doing business as a goldsmith. He's a craftsman. And at this time in England, gold was circulating as money. There's coins, sometimes ingots, but gold was money, and people were paying with gold. The only thing is, gold is very valuable, of course, and a lot of people are a little bit nervous about just keeping gold like in the house where you put it like under the bed or whatever. And so at a certain point, around 1600, what happened is somebody said, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over to this goldsmith shop, and that goldsmith in his shop has got like a safe, and I'm going to go in there and see if that guy will hold on to this gold for me. And so somebody take gold, let's say 100 ounces of gold in, and say, hey, would you hold this gold for me? And the goldsmith will say, yeah, I will. Maybe some little charge, for space in my safe and things like that. So here you go. The goldsmith not only had a place to keep it safe, but also the goldsmith would know if that was pure gold. Like if you didn't have a lot of expertise in this area and somebody came along and there was a lump of lead that kind of looked like gold, Then you go, oh, okay, gold, and then really it's lead. And then later on, somebody'd show up and say, I want my gold, and you say, here you go, and they say, hey, that's lead. I want the real thing. You've cheated me. Anyway, the goldsmith could find out if that was real gold. He had the expertise and so forth. So anyway, if you came to this goldsmith and said, hey, could you hold this gold? And he says, yeah. Then what you get is basically a warehouse receipt. It was a receipt. But nowadays, we would say a warehouse receipt, because this is basically a warehouse that's for storage purposes. And it would say something like 100 ounces of gold, and they could put down, you know, what fineness is it, 99%, 94%, whatever. And then the goldsmith would sign it. What would he sign? Smitty. I'm thinking that's what the goldsmith's name would be, Smitty. And then over time, more and more people would do that because they don't want to hold this gold, and they've got a place down here to keep it for safekeeping. Goldsmith already had a safe, right, because he's working on gold. He's already got a need for a safe, and so he's just holding a little bit more. Well, if you want to buy something, what do? You go down to Smitty, you say, hey, here's this receipt. I want my gold. I'm going to go buy a farm, or I'm going to buy whatever. You get to a certain point, this is all a gradual evolution. You get to a certain point, and what happens is, like, let's say I've got this receipt, and I'm negotiating with you. I want to buy a farm and some livestock and a house and blah, blah, blah. How much do you want to sell it for? 100 ounces of gold. I say, okay, I've got this receipt. I'm going to go down and get the gold. I'll be right back. And then the person I'm selling it to goes, I'd take that piece of paper if it's genuine. I say, well, go down and ask Smitty. You go down and ask Smitty. Smitty goes, yeah, that's mine. So then this person I'm buying these things from says, I don't really want a bunch of gold. I'm just going to take it down and put it in Smitty's safe. And so you say, well, here, I'll give you this piece of paper. And then over time, somebody did it the first time, who knows who, somebody did it the first time, and then somebody else, and somebody else, and somebody else, and then after a while, this piece of paper starts being used as money. And once that starts being money, I might say, Smitty, I'll give you 100 ounces of gold, but I don't want a 100-ounce receipt. Why don't you give me, 5 10s and 10 5s? I want to make change. I want something smaller, or give me 100 ones at 1-ounce receipts. And so after a while, Smitty's printing this pieces of paper up, and you take the gold, put it away, give you a bunch of smaller denominations, and then you just use that as currency. Now, that's one thing that banks do for us today, right? Banks today give us a checking account, a check, but banks in the early United States would just give you currency, and Smitty's doing that, but he's still not a banker. The other part of banking is Smitty starts building up more and more and more gold in the safe that he's holding for people. He's warehousing this. After a while, it gets to be such a big business, he stops working on gold and is just like taking in these, like deposits and giving out these pieces of paper. But after a while, Smitty's got a big safe. He's got, maybe some armed guards that are hanging around and making sure nobody robs him and so forth. And after a while, Smitty's got vast amounts of gold. And then somebody goes, boy, I'm getting ready to start a business. I wish I had 10,000 ounces of gold. Then I could get my business off the ground. Or maybe the king says, I want to go conquer France. I wish I had 50,000 ounces of gold. But there are these needs for the gold, and so a big business manager or maybe the king goes to Smitty and says, hey, I want to borrow some gold from you. And Smitty goes, oh, I couldn't do that. I promised these people I'm going to hold on to it. Well, okay, you promised that, but do you ever run out of gold? No, people seldom cash these receipts in. They're happy to have the piece of paper. Well, then you could loan that to me. And Smitty said, it would be wrong. And then they said, well, why don't you loan me 10,000 ounces of gold, and then I'll pay you back next year 11,000. And Smitty said, oh, you never put it that way before. Yeah, okay. I'll give you 10, you give me back 11. Okay, we got a deal. And so Smitty started making loans. He's got all this gold, he's making loans. That's what banks do. Banks take in deposits and give you something you can spend. Nowadays, we would say a checking account. But back then, give you something you can spend, this piece of paper. That's the first function of a bank, is take these deposits in and hand back medium of exchange. And the other thing bankers do is make loans. Guess what Smitty does after a while? He says, man, this is pretty good. I'm charging people to hold their gold, and now I'm charging other people to use that same gold. And then after a while, Smitty says this, hey, you know what I could do? I could just get a bunch of paper and just write something like 100 ounces of gold on it and sign my name. I could loan that piece of paper to people. That's as good as money. People are buying stuff with these papers. Why don't I just start writing my name on paper and making loans of those papers? And that's what he did. And so Smitty became a banker. He's taking deposits, giving back a medium of exchange to the depositor, and then making loans, and that turned into the form of modern bank currency that we use in the United States. The next point in our evolution is a checking deposit. And that is what we will start with next time. So long, I'll see you then.